In this episode, we're going to be talking about the sophistication left behind by what are known as the lost civilizations around the world, where instead of just isolated pockets of groups, it's more of a global civilization that stretched from North America through Egypt all the way into Asia. The evidence left behind proves that our story and our history is far more complex and older than we're told. One of the hardest things to grasp about our history and how far back it goes is the conditioning that we've been taught in school. Being told that our history only goes back 6,000 years in a linear way to where we went from being very primitive to the highest state we are now in a linear way. But what the evidence shows around the world is that's not the case at all. Instead, our history is far more complex, stretching thousands and thousands of years longer than we're told. And the evidence to prove that is all right around us. Left behind in megalithic blocks, precision, and high sophistication from civilizations that left behind structures that we can't even rebuild today. The first place we need to start is in Egypt, to the most famous of all with the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the sophistication left behind, not from the pharaohs like we're taught in school, but by the Predynastic Egyptians that came long before them, known as the Cometians in the land of Kemet. This greatly differs from what we're taught in school and shows you that not only the Egyptians were predated by an earlier civilization, but areas all around the world by civilizations we think of as Atlantis and Lemuria and the Cometians in Egypt. All of these civilizations once were connected by shared knowledge that goes back all the way to the Fertile Crescent by the lowering of kingship and the Anuna gods. In the last episode, we discussed cuneiform tablets and the human origin story. In this episode, though, we're going to be talking about something much more sophisticated, when those civilizations rose up to become much greater than even our current civilization today. Maybe not perhaps in the technological level like we have with computers and cars, but in terms of their knowledge and understanding the celestial aspects of the universe, they were far ahead of us in their understanding and their knowledge, and they encoded that knowledge in the megalithic structures, temples, and pyramids they left behind. Those civilizations, the ones that came long before 6,000 years ago, before what's known as the Younger Dryas period of Earth catastrophes, around 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, those civilizations that predated that time period are known as the lost civilizations of history. And that's where this story begins. When we travel back more than 13,000 years ago, we get into a time period that's largely unknown to history, something that isn't even discussed. And in our history books, we're told that the civilizations around the world, from the Inca of South America to the Egyptians, all the way through to the Mayans and the civilizations in China and Japan, that they rose up from a very primitive basis to reach the level they're at now, and that was the height of their sophistication. But what we find when we actually study the evidence is that's not the case at all. Rather, we find the rise and fall of civilizations have occurred over and over again, and every time that happened, more and more knowledge was lost. So how far back does this story go? We don't fully know, but evidence shows from geologic records, looking at ice core samples of the way that the Earth was thousands and thousands of years ago, and then looking at these megalithic structures and radiocarbon dating them, that this goes back well before 13,000 years ago. And what we find is an entire global civilization that built incredible structures that was then destroyed, leaving behind the remnants that they once were here. Think for a moment what would be left from our civilization if some great Earth catastrophe occurred, like a cosmic impact or some coronal mass ejection. What would be left from us today? Most of our records are kept in digital form, paper. That paper would only last 500 to 1,000 years. All of our metal structures would corrode after several hundred years of not being maintained. What would be left over? Maybe some plastic, maybe some remnants of stone buildings, but not much. Imagine if a couple thousand years went by and our civilization largely disappeared, and only isolated groups around the world survived and then found the remnants of that. What would they think of us? What would they know of us? Very little will be left over. And that's why it's so incredible that all we have is not only just little scraps and pieces, but extensive evidence around the world, which shares similarities of not only building styles, but incredible knowledge encoded in megalithic temples and pyramids that shows that these civilizations knew a lot more about celestial aspects, mathematics, the Earth's precession of the equinox, and all of these different aspects that we don't really think about today. But why did they care so much about that? We're going to be getting into understanding not only what they knew, but in later episodes, what destroyed them. So in this episode, we're going to go around the world and look at what the evidence is left behind for where these lost civilizations were and how sophisticated they were. The first place to start is let's start in Egypt, in an area known as Kemet. That region today is what we think of as Giza. Now, this is not what we would consider the dynastic pharaohs of Egypt, such as Khufu, something that predated long before them. So in school, we're told that the Great Pyramid of Giza is known as the Pyramid of Khufu. But why are we told that? We're told that the reasons the pyramids were created was to be tombs for the pharaohs, and yet no pharaoh has ever been found in the pyramids of Giza. So why are we told that? It seems to me that when we're told the reasons for why these structures were created and who they were created by, allows us to not understand the truth behind it. If we were to actually look at the data, we would find out that nearly every pharaoh in Egypt was buried hundreds and hundreds of miles to the south of the Great Pyramids of Giza in a place called the Valley of the Kings. So then why are we told that they were built as tombs? It greatly takes away the reasoning behind why they were built. When we look at the Great Pyramid of Giza and the sophistication behind the more than 1 million blocks between 10 and 15 tons each that were created to build that structure, we think that it would just be easy for us to replicate today. And yet, there are certain star shafts that connect to alignments with Sirius and Orion that are perfectly aligned, but not in this time period we have. Because of the precession of the equinox, those pyramids were aligned to those star constellations well over 13,000 years ago, and as much as almost 40,000 years ago, if we look at a time period known as Zep-Tepi, which means the very first time in Egypt. The very first time for what, though? Just like in the Fertile Crescent, like we talked about in the last episode, when those original pre-Diluvian cities were created, Zep-Tepi represents when the first grand civilization of Egypt emerged, known as Kemet. That's when we are told that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built. Things like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. He states that he was part of building those pyramids. But how did they do that and have such sophistication with mathematical precision and star alignments? Something that we can't even replicate today. This goes to show you, furthermore, that the knowledge that they knew that was carried and passed down to them was lost more and more over time. And we think we're at the height of our sophistication now, but we don't even understand how they were able to build those structures today. The best evidence left behind by these incredible civilizations is not just found in these sophisticated pyramids and temples, but it's found in what are known as the megalithic structures of the world. Now, what does megalithic mean? It means large single stones, but not something in a crude manner like Stonehenge. That's often something that people get confused with. I'm not talking about simplistic monoliths. What we're talking about is highly advanced and sophisticated megalithic structures, mostly built out of granite, an extremely hard stone. But why is that important? One of the things that's greatly lost from our culture today in understanding why those blocks and why those remnants left behind are so significant is understanding what's known as the Mohs hardness scale. The Mohs hardness scale represents the hardness factor of a specific stone. And the reason that's important is that if you were told that that civilization that created that, you was using bronze and copper tools that are softer than the stone they're working with, it would have been impossible to manipulate them. That's why we know when we look at the specific hardness of these stones like granite, being a hardness on the Mohs scale of about a 7, we know that it would have been impossible for the civilizations that we're told in school to have created those structures. What does that mean? It means that the civilizations that created these places around the world that we're about to review had tools and sophistication that was far beyond the civilizations that could have ever created them, as we're told in our history books. In fact, some of the remnants that are left behind, such as saw marks and perfect drill holes, could have only been done with some kind of diamond technology or some kind of laser technology. And to be honest, we don't even fully understand how they created some of them today. But what we find is precision that's so perfect that even with the best masons we have around the world, we can't replicate a lot of these structures. So let's go around the world and look at some of these structures to understand their importance, and then get an idea of how grand and extensive these lost civilizations were. Since we already covered Egypt, let's continue and trek east around the world. The first place we're gonna go is thinking about the Greek culture. Now, we're told in school that the ancient classical Greeks came and arose and then built certain cathedrals and temples, and then largely were turned into like the Roman Empire and became what we think of as that culture. But that's actually not what the evidence is at all. Plato describes how there was a pre-Greek culture that existed long before the classical Greeks. So what does that mean? It means that all around the world, nearly every single one of these locations I'm about to mention is falsely credited with a later civilization that originally built it. Now, the challenge is that one of the ways that empires go through and conquer certain places, especially the Roman Empire, is that they would find existing temples, largely destroyed, and then build on top of them. And then they were claimed ownership as being created by them. But that's not the case. When we look at the classical Greeks, areas through Italy, right, traveling east into Baalbek, Lebanon, with Roman architecture on top, we find something completely different in the bottom structures. Now, it takes a trained eye and understand what these are to tell the difference between what are the lost civilizations, also known as the pre-Diluvian civilizations, and the later cultures that existed. And what you'll see are smaller and smaller stones being used on top. Also, often mortar or brick used, filling in the gaps, whereas these other civilizations that existed before used none of those things. They simply took these massive blocks, somehow created them with high precision, placing them so closely fit together that not even a human hair or a piece of paper can slip through the middle of them. It wasn't that these civilizations slowly rose up and then just disappeared because they overused their resources. What we find is the complete opposite. We find that at the height of their sophistication, all around the world, that they just disappeared. And in the next episode, we'll be discussing why and how that happened. Starting in Baalbek, Lebanon, as we travel east from Greece, we find some of the largest megalithic blocks in the world. Below the Temple of Jupiter, we have blocks that are over 1,000 tons, the largest being called the Trilithon block that weighs 1,100 tons, something that we would even have trouble lifting with cranes today. And yet the Romans are giving credit for building that, even though they could never have moved those structures. So just like we see in Egypt, with the Pyramid of Khufu being credited to the pharaoh Khufu, we find that he had nothing to do with the creation of that pyramid. That's why I call it the Great Pyramid of Giza. And we'll see the same thing around the world, where false names were used for who created them that had nothing to do with their creation. Just like in Baalbek, Lebanon, getting back to that location, we call that the Roman Temple of Jupiter, but the original structures at the bases has nothing to do with the Romans. And that's what you're going to see all around the world, is that the lowermost levels contained the highest sophistication everywhere, and then the stuff on top was more primitive. But that doesn't make any sense according to what we're taught in school. Because think about it, if a civilization emerged and became more advanced in a linear way, then when you see the highest sophistication on the top levels and more primitive on the bottom, it's completely backwards though. The most sophistication is always on the bottom, everywhere around the world, and then it becomes more and more primitive, telling us that we lost knowledge over time, not gained it. We see that in Baalbek, Lebanon, the pre-classical Greek cultures. We see that throughout Egypt with the Osirion, the Great Pyramid of Giza. We see that with the colossal statues known as the Colossi of Memnon. These gigantic solid granite statues and blocks that were created from an empire and a civilization that disappeared and left behind these remnants that they were once here. Where else do we find it as well? Traveling east from Baalbek, we find extensive areas of these lost civilizations in places like Hattusa, Turkey. we find an area known as the Lion and the Sphinx Gate. What you see are remnants of a large tower and a gateway with more primitive building around it, showing that instead of the Hittites being responsible for the creation of those civilizations, they came later and built on top of it, just like everywhere else. What we also find in Turkey is we find drill holes, just like in Egypt, and saw marks, showing that the same technology was used in Turkey as it was in Egypt. What's fascinating, if we take a brief moment back to travel to Egypt, we find that in the Temple of Karnak, there's a block known as the travertine block that's a multi-ton block of a mineral known as travertine. That mineral can only be found in Turkey, meaning that we find the similarities with drill holes and structures in both locations, and yet they're over 1,000 miles away, showing that those civilizations were once connected. Now, there are other areas nearby as well that most people misidentify as being a later civilization, such as Petra, Jordan. Now, this is an area of the world where we start getting into very similar type of architecture, but it slightly differs from Turkey and Egypt and some other places we're going to talk about. Instead of just single megalithic blocks stacked on top of each other, what we find are these giant rock relief doorways that seem to go nowhere. And when we're talking about how sophisticated they are, these are labyrinths of entire temples and doorways created in gigantic mountains in the middle of the desert in nowhere. The best example of that is in Petra, Jordan, where we find one of the largest extensive areas of rock reliefs in the world. How did they create them? Built out of solid granite sometimes. Again, those tools would have been impossible to manipulate those structures. Nearby in Iran, an area that's had very little attention, there's a set of rock relief structures just like Petra, Jordan, called Nash-i-Rostam, in which we find these gigantic doorways carved out of sheer mountainsides. And yet we aren't asking the questions on how that could have been done. There's an ancient city next to it called Persepolis. That is, the history is almost unknown. No one even knows who created it. And yet our history books falsely credit later civilizations for its creation. So what's happening here? We're finding evidence that these civilizations all had shared knowledge around the world. And what it tells us is that they all had the same influences that I believe originally rose from ancient Sumer and then rose up to become grand civilizations like Atlantis and Lemuria, which we're going to be continuously talking about as we go along. Traveling further east, perhaps the most bizarre of all of these giant doorways is found in Saudi Arabia, at a place called Madain Saleh, where in the middle of the desert, there are these gigantic singular mountains that are just carved into giant doorways. But the doorways don't go anywhere. And yet we see the same thing across the world in Peru, at a place called Arumurumuru. Why are these giant doorways carved into solid rock, seemingly just for no reason? Is there an ancient technology, perhaps some kind of a portal, a way into another part of the universe that we don't understand because it no longer functions? These are the remaining questions we have to start asking when we look at the remnants that are left behind from these civilizations. Continuing east, it only becomes more fantastic. Traveling east into China, we find the largest single megalithic block in the world at a place called the Yangcheng Quarry. To give you an idea, in Baalbek, Lebanon, the second largest block in the world is known as the Trilithon, that's 1,100 tons. And yet in the Yangcheng Quarry, we have a megalithic block that was not fully dressed, but taken out of its host rock, that's 16,000 tons. It's something we can't even move today. And yet these civilizations were right in the middle of their sophistication, moving these structures and putting them into temples when they just disappeared. Now, some would argue, looking at that block, that it must have been natural, just eroding out of the surface. Except right in the same location as the Yangcheng block, we find gigantic temples that they had already finished carving. So we know that that piece of stone was being incorporated into their work. Now, what's even more bizarre is that there are these structures built off of the stones that are knob-like, that stick out. And we've been told they were built that way to be able to be picked up. And yet they don't seem to function as that at all. Those knob-like structures we find not only in China, but Egypt, and all the way across the world in Peru. The same telltale marks of how a civilization created these giant blocks with these strange knobs that seem to stick out of them for no reason that we can really understand. But the more one looks into it, the more we have to change our mindset. Instead of thinking that these blocks were built and raised by giants, I think the way we have to look at this, from everything from the Great Pyramid of Giza to these giant megalithic blocks that were used in the temples and knobs, was something more aligned with sound and frequency, in a way where you would tune something in an acoustic manner. Perhaps the key to all of this, with ascension of consciousness and energy, with being in a temple that has a certain resonant frequency, something that is largely unknown to us today, that perhaps these temples were created for ascension chambers and a way to go in and reach higher states of energy. Well, how else would they be able to move these? If you have a civilization that's trying to move a block that's over 1,000 tons, would that be something that would manually be done? How would something like that even be moved in a manual way? Perhaps none of them were. Look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, built with 2.5 million multi-ton stones, averaging 10 to 15 tons each. How could they have done that? Well, answers to that can be found in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. It's talked about that was built in a very short amount of time. If we were to look at how long something like that would be done in a manual way, it would take hundreds of years. So then how could they have done it? And how could they have moved these giant blocks? I think what it comes down to that I've studied, we look at harmonics and tuning with the frequency of the human nature. I think there are gifts that have been greatly lost to us that we don't understand anymore. A good example of that is actually found in Florida, in a place called Coral Castle, a place where a single man was able to replicate some of the technology and the means for moving gigantic blocks on his own. But how could he have done that? He claims to have cracked the code of how the ancient Egyptians moved them. And some have stated that he would move these at night, and they would hear certain sounds and certain strange aspects coming from this place. Perhaps he and Nikola Tesla, figuring out the secrets of sound and frequency, maybe they've been right all along. And sound has the ability to raise and levitate certain objects if it has a certain harmonic frequency to it. These are the telltale signs we have to look for how to tell when those original civilizations existed and how they're all connected by the same shared knowledge. From Japan and China all the way to Egypt, we find the same shared knowledge that existed and how to build these and move them. And the sophistication is nearly identical. But that's not the only part of the world that we find that. Traveling south from China and Japan, we find other bizarre megalithic structures in parts of Cambodia with Angkor Wat. In the same areas that we see civilizations that built on top of it, just like other parts of the world. But it's not just Cambodia, but the same architecture we find in Angkor Wat, we find it also just slightly southwest in India. Similar to Petra, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, we find these gigantic doorways and these temples created out of solid mountains. In fact, in India, we find the largest single carved out mountain in the world, known as Kailasa Temple in Ellora Caves, where an entire mountain built out of solid basalt, which is even harder than granite, was carved out to create one of the most intricately and most sophisticated temples in the entire world. Yet we're told that temple was only created a couple thousand years ago. But that same architecture is present all throughout the Middle East, India, into Cambodia. Now here's what's interesting about that. It seems that some of these civilizations were broken up into pockets where they followed a similar type of architecture. It was shared knowledge and similarities in the fact that they had mathematical precision and aligning to the stars. They all had their own slightly different styles. So what we find is in Egypt, up through Baalbek, Lebanon, and into Turkey, we find just single giant megalithic blocks stacked on top of each other. Whereas as we travel east, into Petra, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, rather than single megalithic blocks, they were giant doorways carved out of mountains. Now, slightly differently, in India and Cambodia, instead of just giant doorways, it was more of these giant cave temples that they would create out of solid mountains. But the same type of sophistication is present in each place, showing that those civilizations were linked, but had their own individual styles. Going back to Cambodia, The entire temple is aligned to star constellations and is found on what's known as the 30th parallel. What's remarkable about that is we draw a line from Cambodia west, we go right through ancient Eridu in Mesopotamia, right through into Egypt, and we find this line where these civilizations seem to be building in a very specific spot. And that's what's very important to understand, is that it wasn't that these civilizations necessarily built somewhere because of an abundance of resources, but because of a specific location that aligned with the 30th parallel or a similar ley line that represented the energy of the Earth and the cosmos. Some of these locations were built in extremely arid and difficult places. Traveling further east from Angkor Wat in Cambodia, there's a site known as Sulawesi, Indonesia, where we find gigantic monoliths in a place called the Bata Valley that baffle scientists and archaeologists. The indigenous peoples say that they were there long before them, and that no one knows who even created them. Furthermore, the stones they use to create these giant monoliths are found nowhere in the valley, meaning they had to be brought down high in the jungle mountains. In fact, no quarry has ever been found in Sulawesi to show where these stones came from. But just like in Easter Island, we find these giant monolithic statues that have the same depictions on them. How could that be possible if they're on completely opposite sides of the world? Now, those depictions are found in the lowermost part of the bodies. So Sulawesi, Indonesia, when we look at these monolithic statues and we compare it to places like Göbekli Tepe, an astronomical library in Turkey, all the way to Easter Island with the Moai, we find the exact same symbols on each place. Those symbols represent clasped hands in the lower part of the body. What does that represent? When we look at the symbology of those monoliths, we often find the phallus is shown in the center of those clasped hands, showing that they were symbols for fertility. Fertility was incredibly important to these civilizations, not just fertility representing procreation, but fertility and abundance in nature. It represented the abundance of a civilization with the resources around them and the ability for them to create offspring that will allow their civilization to carry on. But what's amazing about that, they represent opposite sides of the entire planet, showing and proving that it was one global civilization that shared knowledge all over the world. Now, the last part of the planet that we haven't talked about is the area from Mexico down through South America. Now, in Mexico, the megalithic evidence from these civilizations is a little bit more subtle and difficult to find because it was mostly done with limestone. Now, limestone is a much softer material that weathers over time. Possibly the best place we can see the evidence of those giant limestone blocks that survived the test of time is a place called Uxmal. What's amazing about Uxmal is if you go into the etymology of what the name means itself, it means built 3 times. They describe how that temple was built over the course of 3 times, and that the original temple name was the Temple of the Wizards, representing the ancient god known as Kukulkan. Now, traveling further south, we do find megalithic blocks that are not built out of limestone at a place called Mitla. And in Mitla, we find blocks that are over 50 tons built out of solid basalt. Now, we know that because the basalt came from these ancient volcanoes. And again, just like we talked about with the Mohs hardness scale, that basalt would have been impossible to be able to be carved using Bronze Age and copper tools. Meaning that once again, we find evidence of those lost ancient civilizations. The Olmec of Mexico also shows signs of being part of those lost civilizations, building gigantic stone heads out of solid basalt that seem to show striking similarities to a lot of the characteristics of ancient Egyptians. How is that possible if they're on the other side of the world? It seems that the Bering Strait migration route is not really the only answer for how we can understand how all these cultures were connected. Just like the Olmec of Mexico, traveling further south we find connections with both the Olmec and Peru and Bolivia with those civilizations, even in Ecuador as well. It seems the more we look, the more we find evidence of these lost civilizations in places we never imagined. Starting in Ecuador, there's a temple known as Inca Pirca, the Temple of the Sun, that has the same architecture as further south. In Peru, we find several sites, such as Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, and Ollantaytambo, where we find the highest level of sophistication and precision of any of the megalithic blocks in the world. Some of them are so bizarre, these giant polygonal structures that have been put together, that it almost seems like they were superheated or melted to be put in place. The level of sophistication present in those civilizations seems to even surpass anything else around the world. And yet, just like we find in Egypt, or in Asia, or in Baalbek, Lebanon, at the height of their sophistication, when we see these blocks sticking out of quarries half carved, they just disappeared. And as we get into the next episode, we're going to be discussing the reasons why these lost civilizations just suddenly disappeared, and the evidence left behind for what could have caused those civilizations to rapidly vanish. Perhaps those same reasons could apply to our civilization now. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Mystery School of Truth. In the next episode, we're going to be looking deeper into the evidence of these lost civilizations for what could have caused their demise, and what's left over to prove that ancient Earth catastrophes destroyed them over and over again, and every time they rose to fall, more and more knowledge was lost.